Hello and welcome to Verso Live, a new virtual event program to celebrate 50 years of Verso books. All events are streamed live and will be available to watch again after the event has finished via our YouTube channel. Questions and comments can be made via the YouTube chat box. We hope you enjoy the event.
Hi, it's so great to be here with McKenzie Wark. My name is Legacy Russell. I'm the Associate Curator of Exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem and the author of Glitch Feminism, a manifesto, which just dropped from Verso Books a couple days ago. But I'm really pleased to be here with the legendary McKenzie Wark, like crush of my life, author of many, many books, too many to name here, but most recently she's published 3 that are just generally game changers. Capital is Dead from Verso Books, Reverse Cowgirl from Semiotext, and then Sensoria, which I am living with right here, via Verso Books as well. So thank you, McKenzie, for being here with me. It's just like teen dreams coming alive.
Well, right back at you. It's a pleasure, and thank you for having me in this event. And we had a little, chat about this beforehand, and we just picked keywords to go through. And then we'll keep an eye on the chat and see if there are things that people want to bring up, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, you want to start us off? I haven't got my phone.
I love, because McKenzie, I guess something that keeps coming up as I keep thinking about the text that you've built over so many years of time. And you are honestly one of the most prolific writers and thinkers that I know. So there, are so many intersections there, but maybe to start with abstraction, right? Because I recognize that there is so much about that kind of in your early text that continues to travel as a through line. And not to kind of embarrass you, but, I have to say, Hacker Manifesto, as it came out, the text itself, you wrote from the very beginning, we are the hackers of abstraction. We produce new concepts, new perceptions, new sensations hacked out of raw data. So, I'm wondering maybe if we could start there and to think very much so about the ways in which abstraction can kind of do radical work.
Thank you. That's a good starting point, I think. There was a sort of, and this comes out of the context of the 80s and 90s and that tendency to sort of fetishize difference in the particular. But it seemed to me that the world that was getting built was actually about the abstract, and the abstract kind of was what was making all of those differences possible. Like there's a sort of dialectical tension that was getting left out. So what would it mean to seize the powers of abstraction? Struck me as a political aesthetic kind of project. And abstraction here means, in the aesthetic or conceptual sense, to be able to see form. But it also means, to what extent are our lives governed by real abstraction, by sets of kind of technical economic processes and military processes that are sort of abstracting from particular places and times and sort of unifying and bulking them or shearing through them. And how do we interact with that?
Yeah, I think it's for me, I always struggle, I think, when thinking about abstraction, and this too kind of, of course, intersects with this question of the glitch too, recognizing that, as you said the other night, so incredibly, it keeps ringing in my head, of course, that chaos is more profitable, right? And I think that sometimes a read of a certain type of abstraction is through the lens of a chaotic space, right? That actually it, can block us from being able to navigate certain systems, or perhaps, challenge how we may or may not be able to sustain our lives or be safe in certain spaces by simply making things, illegible, right? But then there's that kind of tension too, in that actually there is something that's very empowering about illegibility, and that abstraction lends towards that, like this certain presence of opacity that actually could be, really exciting and promising.
Yeah, and I'm sort of glad you headed us in that direction a little bit. And I've been thinking about the relationship of, I was thinking about the hack 20 years ago, and then just sort of reframing of that as the glitch, which actually seems much more contemporary to me and seems like a more useful language. There's a kind of intentionality and claim to mastery in the hack, and the glitch doesn't necessarily have that, but it doesn't exclude it. And there's a way in which you can think one's glitch subjectivity and body as things that you don't entirely have agency over, that that's the chaos element, that there's a kind of abstract world that's kind of putting you into this position where you're the thing that stops it processing normally, whatever that might mean. And that's the thing to kind of hold on to and pay attention to. Over to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I'm kind of like turning over what you're saying in kind of thinking through this question too of alienation.
Right.
And, for me, the thing that is really resonant about this question of the glitch, which does feel really present in the here and now. We're seeing it in lots of places and spaces, and it can be something that's actually quite empowering and emancipatory, as a vehicle to think through our own position in the world intersectionally. But, this question of alienation feels useful because, as I worked on this text, it was something that, was a sort of through line across the questions that were being asked, right? Like, what ways are these systems deeply alienating to us? And in what ways actually perhaps, might we navigate them differently? And so, I wonder too, in thinking about, the work that you've built and the kind of explorations that you've done across, different types of both sort of science as it touches with other disciplines of thought, that, what alienation does. And, perhaps too, how that is mediated by our screens and or helped by it.
Yeah, there's a whole actually sort of affirmative literature on what alienation might make possible. Henri Lefebvre and Jean-François Lyotard and so on. I was always very interested in like rather than take this always as your kind of you're alienated as labor from the product of your labor, which remains the case. But then what's the affirmative way that you can use that? And cultural studies branches off into that to go, well, here are forms of, we're only allowed to construct ourselves in a disalienated way in certain other spheres, but here they are, kind of thing. But what I love about your book is that you're connecting that more specifically to the alienation of the Black and queer body. So there's a whole other literature and sort of aesthetic practices you could draw this out of that then sort of decenters this, I think, in a really useful way. And one can think then the glitched body self-subjectivity as a kind of affirmation, kind of like it's not, it's not just the thing that stops a process from happening. Oh, that's where something else can start to happen.
Absolutely. I mean, I think too, McKenzie, it like feels exciting to me as well, because, within that, it's not about the sort of definition of alienation as in being alone, right? And being kind of isolated from other folks, but rather that actually within this process of kind of hacking or glitching, that there's collective action there and that is actually a shared space.
Yeah. And, I came out so late, I didn't realize that I didn't have to be alone with that, glitched sense of myself. And actually, and this is the thing that where your book starts in a way is how one can find others whose experience resonates with that. And the internet enabled that. And while we're very much in this mode at the moment of how like terrible the internet is, and it's basically a collection of hell sites, all of which is true, and it's thus just there to extract surplus information out of all of us to the greater glory of Amazon and Apple or whatever, all true, right? We know that. But then how is it enabling to just say that? Like the other thing to say, and again, it's the cultural studies tradition, it's like, what's our agency? Like we don't have the agency to really do much about that, but we do have the agency to construct worlds together where that alienation could be positive. And that's long been the experience of, I can't speak to Black bodies, but definitely of queer bodies and trans bodies and so on. And that we can see all of our experiences there is actually different, but relying on the same glitched relation to abstraction. So how do we all these things as belonging together starts to become, rather than always be sort of chunked out and separated, to view all of our agencies as connectable.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that, looking at the material of your work, I've always been so inspired, from the Hacker Manifesto to present, of ways that you are bringing in other texts. And so in thinking about alienation and abstraction, and as well, what Glitch Feminism aims to do in bringing kind of other citations in to kind of build a different type of language, right? That has felt, really exciting and promising, figuring out a way for us to kind of speak as Black people, as queer people, right, through a trans politic, right, trying to navigate these different questions of, what language is and how actually in it of itself, it, is a violence, right? We're kind of trying to figure out ways to use these words differently and to kind of build our own spaces where those things can be housed safely and historicized, as opposed to perhaps, existing in a space of alienation within a kind of academic canon or art historical one or even technological one. So, I was loving thinking about, this quote that you use in Capital is Dead, that, we reach towards speaking the beautiful language of our century, which is Guy Debord. Noting that, and I found that to be something that was, really useful. What is that beautiful language? How does that work? What does it mean to kind of define that for ourselves?
Yeah, and actually now I sort of wonder if beautiful is the right aesthetic. I'm thinking Sian Nai's wonderful book on our aesthetic categories. So so like to just rephrase it on the fly, what's the interesting language of our century? What's the cute language of our century? What's the zany language of our century? Like,
I'm thinking as well, like Elaine Scary and like, A Beauty in Being Just. Like, what is the just language too? What is just and cute? Both.
Yeah. Let's have multiple aesthetics but of our century is sort of like the key part to the phrase, which is to think history. Like, how do we think historically? How our various agencies, still maybe have the residue of the possibility of historical agency in them. And then thinking about what you're doing in Glitch Feminism is in how are artists kind of avatars of those little spaces of possibility. It's not really up to artists to do everything. Like artists can't also be an activist and be a theorist and be like, we put too much weight on it. But I think to sort of resonate with some sort of possibility, and you sort of find these, there's one for each section of the book, and it's kind of like, look at this. Like here you see an embodiment and an expression of how agency could be thought both at the individual level, but in a way that's connectable.
Right. I mean, I think, as part of, for me, like, coming up as a baby queer, existing in the world from youth to present, and recognizing that so much of my experience in kind of traversing academia and institutionalized spaces often came with a sense of, feeling like an outsider, even though very much so, I was in these spaces. And so for me, that was something that, continues to be and has been, I think, a sort of amazing and baffling experience is how do you feel maybe like an outsider when you're very much so standing in the center of different types of spaces, it's tied to theory or practice, what have you. And so, the book for me is trying to do some of that work too, of recognizing, some of those questions about what it means to engage with these systems of gatekeeping and of power, actually the realities of what it means to be visible in these spaces and to be doing this work. As you said, that is weighty work, right? Like we can't occupy every single space all the time, be both, sort of theorizing and, as an activist, as an artist, like how those different identities may need to shift over time as we're trying to figure out, how to expand within them. But, I have felt very strongly that it's useful to find our own language, trying to figure out what that looks like. And as well, too, to kind of call on folks who are doing that work, like, thinking of in the book, Essex Hempel or Lucille Clifton, folks who, historically have not always been centered in discussions about technoculture, right? But actually recognizing that Black work and queer work have done so much to support and emancipate each other's theory and thought. And that actually that, the space that it occupies within an academic space or pedagogical often is one that, makes very rare and unfamiliar the things that we carry in our bodies as Black and queer people.
Yeah. And I think that's an important movement that's going on right now is to think race and technology together. There are some sort of like really obvious ways that really has to be done, but there's kind of like, obviously the way algorithms are discriminatory and so on. I'm not discounting that. It's incredibly important work, but also to get to the other layers of that as well. One of which being that race and technology is intimately connected from the get-go. They're not things that you arbitrarily put together, like one implicates and implies the other completely. And the other thing I think is more what you're doing, is like, here are all of these other ways that a technique can be used. Like, here are how you misuse this thing to create a space of possibility for another way of life. And yeah, like, and it's like, all right, motherfuckers, like, here it is, it's documented, like, you can't deny it anymore. Like, here's another set of contemporary artists, people they draw on, literatures they're connected to, because it's like, and that's just endless work, isn't it? It's just trying to open these little spaces in institutions where those things can be. But it's like, it isn't a word that was on our list, but institution is a word maybe we should talk about.
Yes, please.
Because we have a foot in them, but I don't think I would strongly identify with them. So yeah, what does it mean to be doing work in an institutional space for an outside?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, with being at the Studio Museum, the work of the everyday is part of the mission, right? And so in a strange way, in this moment, it has brought up so many incredible feelings, right? Joys and sorrows, as we're seeing the reality of the mission as it intersects with the world, right? But on the other side too, it's been this kind of very useful and I would say generative space, realizing that when I come to work, right, that there are certain things I just don't have to unpack, right? That we're speaking from that place, because that is literally why we've shown up to be, in this collaboration institutionally. So, I think that it has been a different experience for me than perhaps some of my institutional experiences, as they have kind of arced over my life and career, simply because of the fact that mission is so present. But I've thought deeply about the fact that, how that mission work can be possible, right, really needs to embed itself in every institution and as well carry itself out into the world. And that is the thing that I think is the reckoning right now. The thing that actually maybe feels uncomfortable and scary and terrifying is realizing and naming that kind of that spot that is really tender, and realizing that, a lot of spaces and places actually are not wholly committed to that work, seeing that head on, which maybe we know as Black people and queer people, because as we travel through them, we feel deeply alienated within them, right? It's very obvious to us. So to see the rest of the world kind of play catch up has, at points felt very satisfying. But on the other side, you feel rageful. It is so exasperating to see how slow certain types of institutional spaces are to kind of catch up and to figure out a way to put language to some of the things that have been ongoing in terms of systems of oppression.
Yeah, and I'm from the era when we really used phrases like the long march through the institutions and stuff like that. But I just feel like, because this is a moment of retrenchment, accelerated by COVID, it's like all those spaces that one might have tried to create are the things that are going to get cut off first. And it's like, oh my God, there's just like generations of work can be undone now if we're not, mindful. To try to, I like that bit about, the institution is not having to like reinvent everything every day, like some of it's already in there. Like you never win the whole thing, but the little bits of it are there, and you like chip away and try to, create certain spaces inside of it. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's kind of like it's not a glamorous politics, right? But it's
no. I mean, I think also the question of the institution is always one that's really complex as well, because I do feel like that some of the folks who I know and admire the most, who are maybe most critical of institutional spaces, often travel through them, and so those are things too that, as we navigate these discussions, in a broader discourse, as they intersect with questions of agency and politic. And activism, right? And as well, like questions of visibility and representation and care, that those things all kind of have to be carried together. And I feel like it's so much more difficult at points to realize how nuanced some of these threads are, as opposed to maybe seeing them within a binary. So every day I'm kind of trying to navigate those things, but I think through, very much so what kind of gets me out of bed and like wiping the metaphorical like Cheetos off my face. I'm just like, damn it, this world is so hard right now. But, it is a real thing being like, okay, last night may have had a glass of wine too many as I have watched these debates, right? But then how do you center yourself and kind of keep going? And part of that has been, this commitment and very much so a faith, right? Which perhaps, is optimistic. at its root, that there is something there that, can drive us and can be, to continue to be built, and to carry on these legacies, I would say absolutely across different generations as you're speaking. So Glitch Feminism as a book is an optimistic book in that way. It's one that carries a lot of, I think, frustration. And, I definitely feel like I've channeled a lot of my rage through the text in a lot of ways in terms of just my frustrations with the world and wanting it to be a better place, which manifestos let us do. But as well, I think there's a gentleness there because it allows for us to think through that it is even possible to have something that is not necessarily utopic, but rather speaks through a different moment and allows for us to perhaps demand more and actually have that be achieved.
Yeah, it is an era of various pessimisms, right? And I'm super interested in some of those movements. There's definitely a queer pessimism that Lee Edelman started. There's going to be a trans pessimism is being written now. I just know
pessimism, absolutely.
Yeah, and then in a lot of ways, that's the model for some of the other ones. Frank Widdowson and others sort of thinking that we were sold a bill of goods with all these movements. There was really nothing there for us. I think it has a different flavor in queer pessimism. Is just like the reproduction of all this is not our problem. We're with the death drive. And it's a really interesting argument, and I kind of see why it has purchase. But yeah, I always wanted some space of possibility still to be. But on the other hand, I do feel the weight of a series of defeats. Being from the labor movement, we lost. Like the 20th century is a series of defeats of every section of labor movement. I don't know why people fight about whether we should be social democrats or council commune. We lost. All of us lost every single version of it. Why are we having this?
It's a collective loss. And I think that I love that you're saying that because it's such a, I would say, brave thing to say too. That, when we're kind of in our, feeds and Twitter spheres of sorts, it is really easy to assume there are simple answers to these complex questions. But the less convenient truth is that the loss has been collective. And so, when we figure out ways to talk about that, right, actually that's a place where we can unify. And so, I feel really committed to standing in that space, even though it's a space where perhaps we may feel deeply cynical at points and maybe defeated and have to have that second glass of wine because Lord knows, right? But I also, I do hold that as being something that's valuable because, it is a necessary conclusion to get to in order to figure out a way to move forward.
Right. Yeah. I was just trying to keep an eye on the chat, and I'll come back.
I'm thinking about McKenzie, because it brings me to we're talking about binaries of politics, but also I want to
because that's on our list.
Binary. Yeah, and think through ways too where we can talk about that because I loved recently as we were chatting you bringing up this question of binary and how it can work. So maybe unpack that a little bit too as we keep an eye on the chat.
Yeah, because to me that's a tension in your text, and tension is a good place to go work on. Yeah. There's a way that the glitch interrupts media that are binary with something that can't be that's sort of outside of that space, which could be a kind of privileging of the analog in a way. And the thing that then connects to one of the strands of the books, which is escape from gender as a binary. And it's kind of I appreciate, but then it also makes me nervous as kind of, I'm kind of close to the binary trans is such a weird thing, a back formation non-binary, it doesn't really exist, but I kind of feel closer to the people who feel like they need to transit, they need to get to a destination as far as gender is concerned. And then the binary does sort of matter in that sense. So there's it takes a little bit of detailed thought to get through the abolition of gender. To me, means the abolition of the compulsory nature of the one you're assigned, but where being the other one ought to be an option, as is being neither, or inventing a new one. So I think we get stuck on one stage of that and not pass through all of them.
I totally agree. I mean, I have to say that, as someone who's a femme-identified person, the binary, these are things that we choose, right? And that we can kind of try to navigate and choose and fix for ourselves. And so for me, the text is really arguing towards that, right? That the, idea of having it be anything less than something that is self-determined is insufficient. And so, I feel really committed to that too, because, as we know, right, that like what our presentation is, can change and form, and as well kind of, ebb and flow over time as we're trying to navigate, what face we want to wear out into the world, what faces we have, as we're engaging with our screens, and then like how to kind of perform and kind of like flaunt through that, right? And so I'm excited about, all of those different places and spaces. And I was really excited about, of course, Reverse Cowgirl, in terms of, the story that you tell there, because this is a question of self-invention, something that perhaps allows for us to think through how we can be in the driver's seat when it comes to making ourselves over.
Yeah, and Reverse Cowgirl is definitely a book about being like bad trans, like the kind that just wasn't allowed for a long time. Like you weren't supposed to be that kind. I won't say too much about that because we're not talking about the book today. It's not published by Verso.
It's helpful, McKenzie, because I think this question of the binary is really important. When people talk about, abolition where it intersects with a binary politic, and especially where it comes into gender, I often am thinking about it kind of through the lens of anti-Blackness, right? And like, we're thinking about ways where different types of womanhood, who is in and out, right, has been used as a real violence to, keep and gatekeep ideas of different types of privilege and supremacy within these systems. And so I'm angry at that, right? Like I'm like not ashamed about, naming that explicitly and to ask, why is it that we continue to try to fit within these different systems when actually the systems themselves have done such harm to us? So, the question of the binary is one that is intersectional, I guess, in that way, right? It like is something that, presents real like challenges within trying to understand like what bodies are assumed to be, made within a kind of binary model and as well welcomed within it, because we know for a fact, right, that actually is not something that is historically, kind of open in terms of its access.
Yeah, I want to connect this to the next keyword that we picked on, which was free labor. And this might seem like a stretch, but I think it really kind of works because the free labor I'm thinking of is the free labor of Black women generating the styles and attitudes for everybody else and trans and never getting paid for it.
Yeah.
It's sort of one of those really prime examples. Like you just walk down the street and it's like, wow, this is exactly how Black women looked 5 years ago, is now in the mall. And where's their check? And to talk about free labor in the context of the art world and stuff, but I sort of wanted to give it this broader framework that there's this kind of generation of whole entire modes of being that people don't get to, get any benefit from.
I actually, I'm going to go into a reference that I'm sure will be slightly controversial, but, WAP, the song that has come out recently, which, everyone has seen and parodied and, responded to in various forms and formats. But I mention it because when we talk about like the aesthetic of Black women, it's something that I have continued to come back to just kind of be like WAP, WTF a little, recognizing that within it, we're seeing so actively how some of these things are produced and then co-opted and fed back to us. Like that loop is so visible within that as a text. And it's complicated too, because, this is painful. These moments where I think some great affirmations have come from my growing up on the internet, right? Being able to see at points myself in the presentation and sharing and circulation of some of this material, right? Which is empowered and being done kind of for and Black women. But then too, to see, I have these questions of audience, right? And to think through where those different materials and as well, quite literally bodies, right, are being circulated perhaps outside of the audience that was originally intended for. And so I struggle, I think, with this question of, I think as you have said before, this kind of the aggregate value of production, because it is something that, is difficult. It's a kind of no-sum game at points and has a sort of opaque conclusion. I'm not quite sure where we're going with it on a regular basis. When I see Breonna Taylor's image being capitalized on, for example, in terms of a very recent dialogue and discourse, it is devastating to me to see how much that has been aestheticized and capitalized on, and then ways too where that has quite literally become a trend in terms of a visual vernacular, which divorces us from maybe fully having a deeper understanding of the capital and currency of some of these images as materials as they travel through visual culture.
Yeah, I'm just reminded of. I don't know if it started there, but a thing one hears from Black trans women a lot is we want our roses now, like not after the murder, and to be valued now and when alive, like is kind of a radical demand in our country at this time, in much of the world, right? Can I just take a question off the chat?
Yes, and can you also talk about Sensoria, please?
We sort of are a little bit, but the question is from Akila Williams. I wanted to ask, when trying to translate something that's unfamiliar to other people to understand, when is it enough? And what's your thoughts on that?
McKenzie, you dive in.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, I think there's a question about whose job is it to do how much of the translating, and where one is in a kind of network of making ideas actionable. Like there's a lot to be said for really thinking things through in terms of the language of the people that you're speaking to, because that's firstly in a teaching situation, that's what you do. In the situation of politics, that's what you do. In a situation of art, maybe not. Like art maybe is not about always translating something to the point of already being familiar. I think art in particular is about the remaining unfamiliar and really obliging people to come at a language that's not where someone's head is immediately at. I think we need to maintain a space for that, because that's where the experiments happen. Like you have to try it and see if it'll work.
I love that. I have to say, though, that within the context of certain types of translation, as I've spoken about, Glitch Feminism and other types of work and research that I've done out in the world, there have been a few moments, and one of my favorite clips to show when trying to kind of dig into the emotional fault line of what I'm thinking about when I'm kind of thinking about the manifesto, is to show a clip from Waiting to Exhale, and it's the clip where the lead protagonist sets a car on fire and walks away from it. And so, I think of this now because there have been a few times in showing that clip where people, certain people in the room don't know where it's from. And, before we're able to have a conversation about it, the question comes up about, this idea of inciting violence, right? And it's been such an interesting thing, when we think about intersections across discourse of legibility, because as a material, that as a clip, which has traveled as a GIF out in the world, which is something that I think is deeply meaningful in lots of ways as we think about representations of Black womanhood, is not something that is intended to be intersected with this question of just like inciting violence. That as a read is a racialized read, it's a gendered read. It's something that is troubled in its own right. And so when I've had those moments of kind of coming up against certain types of reads in terms of the texts, and this is the visual text, but there are lots of written texts, obviously, that are included within Glitch Feminism as a book. I'm not really interested at points in decoding that for folks or trying to make it, sort of defang it and make it sensible or reasonable or logical for them, because I think that sometimes texts can be for those who are looking for them and who need them. And so something there feels useful to kind of allow for certain material to be encrypted, and not necessarily encrypted as in, unreadable, but rather encrypted as in intended for a specific audience, and allowing that audience perhaps to feel most empowered in their connecting to it and being housed within it.
Yeah, my most unreadable book's my bestseller.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's such a soul.
I mean, excuse my French, but fuck it. Like, you know, there are moments where I just feel like it's not our responsibility in terms of this question of labor, right? To try to make something digestible. And of course, you know, that means that, you know, when we teach these things, when we talk about them, there are, of course, many ways that you can do that without having it be something that can exist in a straight line. And so for me, like, when, you know, to go back to this question of abstraction, there's something there that I think is really wonderful as a kind of blooming to allow something to be an abstract text, and, you know, for people to really have to work for it and come back to it. Some of my favorite texts, you know, have been things that you come back to for years of time because it requires that kind of commitment. And that's kind of, it's a pilgrimage, it's a journey for sure. But I want to talk about, to pivot just really quickly, Sensoria, because McKenzie, I have to say that, you know, it is an incredibly generous text, given that you are bringing in, exactly as we're talking about, kind of other voices into the room, be in conversation with each other in these complex and super exciting ways. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, kind of what that has been like for you to bring and make those choices, right? You know, especially considering how cutting edge these different folks are. You know, you've got Eyal Weissman, you've got, you know, Cory Doctorow, you've got Jackie Wang, right? So you've got these folks who are like, you know, game changers in their field, and they're sharing this kind of intimate house.
Yeah, it's a book about other people. So Sensoria's readings of other people's works, a little bit like Jen Lindeleich's in that regard, you know, and it's sort of like they're like little gifts to people whose writing I really admired and was helpful to me. And this time it's in 3 sections. So the first part's aesthetics, because I think it's important to sort of perceive how we perceive. So how is this framing how I see the world is the first place to start thinking critically. The second middle part of the book I call sort of ethnographic. It's really, can we just decenter our points of view and see the world from somebody else's point of view? Not that we can synthesize that into our own. Like, no one gets to be Hegel anymore. Like, no one gets to synthesize world history, but we can collectively, in a comradely way, share our total views and relate them to each other. That's the middle part. And the third part loops us back to abstraction, where we started. Like, what's the real abstraction? What's the techniques that's sort of shaping the world, and what relations are baked into it about what value is, how to extract surplus information, all of that sort of thing. So the third part is sort of people who are getting into what's sometimes now called infrastructure as a kind of way of study. So yeah, it's a book framed around the problem that unless we figure out how to collectively produce knowledge that can act in the world in such a way that you make one that's habitable, like we're kind of done. Like, this civilization's over, as we all know, and that's the challenge if there's going to be something to replace it. You know, part hinges on that labor of collective knowledge. So it's a book that's trying to thread together some things about how we would practice that. I'm not claiming to have the answer to how you would do it, but it's a little bit of how you would work with other people to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, to call on a kind of turn of phrase from Adrienne Marie Brown, I'm thinking of this word emergent, because, you know, I found the text to be incredibly emergent in this way that, you know, I think is threatening to a certain school of thought. This idea that, you know, everyone must be kind of housed within their disciplines, right? With the question of things being within a field, and then actually maybe not informing each other or being aware of each other. But the emergent presence of this text feels so radical and urgent right now, given the fact that it allows us to perhaps better understand how much we can learn when we actually kind of leave our lane, and that does work for us, you know, allows us to expand how we think about the world, you know, what readership is, to better inform our activisms. So, you know, I found that to be the thing that was, you know, an incredible takeaway as I've navigated the book, and I'm looking forward to, of course, going back to these different sections, especially given that each of these folks, you know, as you unpack their work, this is like quite a syllabus, right? It can be taught from in this really incredible way.
Yeah, and it's, you know, like if you wanted a career in academia, don't do what I did, specialize in something. But there aren't many of those to be had anymore. And you just have to face up to that, like the para-academic universe, which extends a little bit into the institutionalized art world as well, actually. But there too, it's kind of like the fun stuff is all kind of self-generated. And so I find the para-academic discourse going on much more lively than what's happening in a lot of the institutions. So I wanted a book that would connect to that. Like, it's like you can teach yourself. Like, there are ways to do this, you know, with an outside, but still with certain kinds of appropriate kind of checks and balances to make sure what you're doing is not completely kind of crazy, or that if it is crazy, you're going to call it art. Like that's totally fine, but just don't think that it's knowledge. Yeah, it can be another thing. So yeah, it's a little bit aimed at, I mean, I'm maybe at the tail end of that generation where you could do your thinking in the university, it would make room for you. And it didn't make room for everybody, as we know, right? But it's not really making room for anybody at the moment. So how do we conduct the practice of collective knowledge in these mediated spaces that are controlled by a ruling class, is just extracting a surplus out of it. And the university has just been subsumed into that, and is no longer a sort of a refuge like it used to be. Where maybe the art world's not a refuge anymore either. Yeah, like there's a way in which
I think art can be a refuge, but I do feel like it's important to make the distinction between art and art world, right? And that I think is the thing that's like difficult to try to straddle. Like, how do you get into both of those things and figure out a way to kind of get your bearings? McKenzie, as you're talking about extraction, and as well different types of institutions and what extractive labor can look like, I want to maybe pivot to talk a little bit about this question of body work. You've written about this, kind of language of body workers as they exist online and then away from their screens. I'm thinking about, Bella Thorne, please gag me. Thinking about, in terms of the OnlyFans controversy, and for her as a white cisgender straight woman, this question of revealing power in certain systems, that actually aspects of OnlyFans as it, exists as a platform, of course, are highly institutional, but part of the use of them. And as well, I would say, when you talk about knowledge production, right, the kind of knowledge production that is existing within perhaps a movement research and a body work that can stand online and as well exist as an economy, feels really confusing and exciting and challenging and triggering all at once. So I'm wondering maybe to talk a little bit about that, right? Like, what does it mean to kind of think through the question of body work as queer people, as people of color?
Yeah, and it's making me think of people I know who never appear online under their government name, but appear naked all the time. It's like, hi, set of choices. So there's a certain things not public. Like, you'll never know who that person is in the government, and they may have different names in different worlds that they choose, right?
Right.
But flesh, here it is. Like, as long as if you're prepared to pay for it, here's what I look like. I'll feed your fantasies about this particular class of body, kind of thing. It's like, wow, that's a really interesting set of choices about what's public and what's private. And it's sort of
it brings a question about surveillance too, right? Because I think if we're thinking about ways to do that kind of skirting, as you're saying, right, in a weird way, some of that showing of all, right, and perhaps under a different name or using a different identity is working differently than if we're using our government name and we're kind of leaving our data traces out in the world. So it is interesting what you're saying. I love that.
Yeah, although that does make me, everybody's so paranoid about surveillance kind of thing, and rightly so. But I'm just always reminded of the thing the comrades taught me in the late 70s, which was always assume there's an informer. Right? Always assume that someone is going to rat you out. That was just baked into how I think about these things. So I'm always surprised that people are surprised that there would be surveillance. And there's also a certain vanity in assuming we're that important. Our data is mostly of interest only in the aggregate. Yeah. It's kind of oh, you're interested in that brand of shoe, like this, million other people. And you're the 1,000 of that million that also likes this TV show. So is that useful data? That's sort of essentially what they're trying to grab a hold of there. But I want to come back to body work, and I was trying to get out of what was it about those expressions like cognitive labor and immaterial labor I really didn't like. And it's it just didn't comport with my understanding of what a lot of people around me were doing, which was that, wasn't getting back into the body a whole thing we were trying to do in various ways. And when we're trying to get out of that Cartesian sense of the cognitive as separate from the embodied, and with this, among other things, the racism that's implied in that it assumes a certain kind of body. So yeah, what's the corporeality of knowledge seems to me to be important, and that then gets you to how situatedness and embodiedness changes what knowledge is relevant, what bodies feel like they have ownership over it and what don't. So yeah, all of that strikes me as really kind of key, and that's why I'm interested in some of the artists that you've drawn together in glitch feminism, because they're all sort of working that line a little bit, that the glitch kind of passes through the kind of experience of subjectivity, which these days is very much mediated by online. Yeah. Like I'm not a Freudian, like, like mom and dad is the internet, like now, and so me was TV,
Yeah, exactly.
But in what way is that mediated subjectivity and embodiment the thing to pay attention to, and where knowledge gets generated and art gets generated?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much kind of curious about this question of, the kind of somatic as it lives with us. And I think that part of the intuition that Black work and queer work can do, through and beyond the institution and institutional kind of rubrics, is to think through a way of bringing in the somatic and kind of as a knowledge and a history, those things that we, obviously that exist within our lived experience that we carry on our bodies, right, that we express differently, that extend outside of language, that perhaps even can't be spoken, but exist in gesture fully. That is a different type of learning, right? And a different kind of currency too that can be exchanged both generously and extractively, when we're kind of thinking of systems of power and how they operate. So, I guess I'm curious about within that this notion to kind of gently pivot to Donna Haraway, right? Because I think that kind of some of her scholarship has come up a lot in more recent history, and in the last 6 months has been deeply embedded, of course, in discussions of nature cultures, thinking of taxonomies, and as well thinking of questions of what a human even is, right? And I think that this is something that when we think about, through the lens of social death and physical death as tied to Black people and queer people, feels really important to navigate and try to deconstruct a little bit. So, I'm wondering about how we can kind of untangle ourselves a little bit. You've written so beautifully about Amy Cesar's Negritude, which I think pushes back a little bit at Donna Haraway's nature culture, and gives us some other understandings too about ways where a diasporic history can help push boundaries in thinking about what is and is not sort of natural, organic, true or false. What exists within these different binaries that can be troubling.
Yeah, and I kind of think there's two Haraways in a way, and one has become a kind of metaphysician. And the one I think got left behind a little bit was much more interested in practices and through what's the knowledge produced out of feminist challenges to the medical regime about reproductive health and things like that. How did the construction of genetics as a body of knowledge produce a different kind of knowledge than traditional understandings of race, and yet reproduce it in a different form? Like, she was asking me sophisticated questions about how worldviews emerge out of practices. Where she went later is, well, let's have an alternative metaphysics. I don't can do that. Like, that's where I don't think that works. Like, I think you always generate knowledges out of practices. Like, they're not going to come from the master thinker gifting us with this other worldview. Like, that's not it. The thing to do is to rethink what's the collective labor that might produce the other worldviews, drawing on, and she's very good on this in Cyborg Manifesto. Like, we're inside of it. Like, we're inside, we are that cyborg. How from the inside can you glitch it? Like, that's where I think what you're doing is a useful language to kind of connect to that. Because like the problem was when you're trying to generate your whole worldview, is it doesn't leave room for other ones, or if it does so in a way that makes them a component of something they don't want to be a component of. And that's where something like Amy Cesar is so useful, yeah? Because it's kind of like, you know what, I'm just going to think all of this from Martinique.
Yeah,
I'm going to invent surrealism. Breton has the fake, I've got the real one, and it's here, and you can kind of, there's kind of limits to it. It maybe the way it treats gender is a little suspect, right? But it's like he's thinking it in a certain way. And you can't synthesize these things. That's the thing to let go of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, and just to kind of acknowledge this note in the chat, like this is this question of consciousness and a way where those things can be rebuilt. And so, that kind of thinking about, as you're saying, these kind of tensions within Haraway, but as well to a sort of expansiveness that feels necessary as we're lending ourselves to trying to navigate new politics. And as well, like maybe think through ways where the world can be, sort of torn down, rebuilt, and then rebuilt again, because that feels like something that, of course, is really necessary right now, given all that's happening in the world. I guess as we're kind of thinking through these questions of technics, I wanted to maybe put another one of our keywords as we were thinking, of prosthetic out into the ether here, to see if maybe we want to touch on it.
Right. I was just looking at my bookshelf, see if I could show a book for the people in the chat. There's a really great anthology on Black surrealism, and I think the really useful bits of Césaire, besides Discourse on Colonialism and the prose poem, are in there. Sorry, what was the word? Prosthetic was the one you wanted to. Yeah, and it has to be made a term that's kind of more reversible than we usually think. Prosthetic usually assumes a kind of extension of the human, and McLuhan, like, underrated as a theorist, extensions of man is his whole keyword. To what extent is any, media is anything that extends the human to the world in a different way in McLuhan. But firstly, man, let's not say that. And secondly, extensions of, like, to what extent does the world extend into us? So the prosthetic is reversible.
Right.
There's also nature reversing itself into us in ways that, kind of make irrevocable changes. And that's sort of the problem that we're in. So, yeah, to think the human and technics is kind of always there, that the human technic nature is like a continuous set of mediations that then is, we're parceling out bits of that and pretending like we're separate. Or we want to pretend that the thing I think is really dangerous is to pretend that we're separate from the techniques, but somehow we can be back with nature without, like, to me, that's the route to fascism, is to try to make that, to leave that bit out, or one of the routes. So, yeah, the techniques is the thing I think that becomes central to think. And it's where, like glitch is a useful metaphor, because it's very much a technical one. It's a word invented in the computer age and then sort of generalized. It's a program that stopped working at some point,
right?
Sort of stumbles over something. So, yeah, I think techniques is central, and that's why Sensoria ends with it in a way. Like, it begins with interface of our experience of it and ends with, like, let's understand it as the thing that's kind of generating a series of very different experiences of the world.
I mean, I'm thinking, of course, of Paul B. Preciado's Countersexual Manifesto, right? To bring another manifesto into the room, and in thinking about this question of techniques, but also of prosthetics, and ways to kind of thread back through, earlier in our conversation, aspects of that can help us negotiate the binary differently. That this question of the prosthetic as a reversible thing, as a flexible thing, as something that is movable, right, and can kind of travel with us in these different ways, allows for so many more possibilities, and two, allows us maybe to have more nuanced and, I would say, like, complex read on what a body can be, in thinking about the very nature of ways where we are existing across our femme identities, right? As well, embodying different parts of what a kind of femme or masc self might be, and the tropes within that are both super triggering and troubling, but also important to try to explore and go deep on, to better understand why it is maybe that some of those things are so sort of all-encompassing and overwhelming. So, I think, when I'm thinking about prosthetics, very much so about Paul B. Preciado, given that, within the Countersexual Manifesto, there's this focus on, quite literally, right, like, what are our sexual prosthetics, right, and how do those things work? And, I know that, of course, Preciado has done some incredible work thinking about that through the lens of pharmaculture, too, which is like a whole other territory. But I feel like that, there's something there that feels really exciting. And for myself too, as I continue to kind of navigate aspects of my Blackness and queerness, thinking about a way where a diasporic history can continue to intersect, generously with these questions of prosthetic towards emancipatory means feels timely.
Yeah, and it's actually a criticism sometimes made of Preciado. It remains a somewhat Eurocentric,
right?
And it's like, not everyone can do everything. Like, I really want to. I love Preciado's writing. There's certain things it doesn't do. Like, it doesn't engage with race.
Yeah.
There's certain things it does do, and you can apply it that way. You could, use it that way. And somebody else will have that covered, but they've really not thought about dildos the way that Preciado has. And And to me, it's like, thank you. It's a way out of the sort of the laconosphere, right? Because it's the penis, the phallus, and the dildo. It gives you 3 terms. And totally here for the third of those, as readers of Reverse Cowgirl will know. Like, thank you. Like, we'd have a whole other economy that, like, detaches phallus from symbolic and penis from imaginary, from body. It's called the dildo, and it builds a whole universe.
And I think as well, like, the imaginary of that, right? Like, is flat if we read it again within the binary, that actually the use of that as a kind of a technology in and of itself, right, is something that often exists within a flat read when we talk about sexuality and kind of lived experience too, in the way that maybe we can navigate those things out in the world and, within the privacy of our own, communities of sorts. So, I struggle at points with that too, because I agree with you. Like, I think Preciado presents as if there is that sort of a neutral read on some of these things, but the read is one that I think can come with so much privilege. And so that's, I think, the reason why maybe I wanted to bring it up and maybe poke at it a little bit, just to think through ways where, it can be opened up even further. I'm seeing this question in the chat about glitch feminism and xenofeminism, and, I'm recognizing the time. It's a big question, but I will say that, there is, I began writing about glitch feminism before the Xenofeminist Manifesto was published, online many years ago. And it was interesting to kind of note the presence of it out in the world as it kind of traveled through different types of spaces in terms of discourse. I think that there are threads to share in trying to, think of a way across maybe a syllabus in terms of the knowledge of it and what it can do, these different manifestos to be of support to one another. But, largely, I would say glitch feminism is quite different than xenofeminism, and kind of looks to address things differently in thinking about a history of performance and artists who are doing that work actively and critically, and as well perhaps is, I would say, more intersectional with Black thought in a way that is much more pronounced. And that, for me, is important to underscore. But yeah, I guess we're right at time. And McKenzie, I have to say, like, I live with these books. I love these books. It's like literally joy of joys. I keep them right by my bed so I can come back to them. And I have the terrible habit, which is not so terrible, of leaving traces in all my books. So of course I dog ear them. Exactly, and treat them terribly. Those are my marks of love. So I will say that, like, it's so exciting to be sharing this moment, which I know is so absolutely batshit insane. But also, I think that the work that you have done has been so monumental in just creating space for this conversation to even be possible. And so, it's like I said, at the beginning of the conversation, it's like, oh, be still my beating heart. And we're just so grateful for the work and what it keeps giving us.
Well, like now that I'm officially old, like to have made space for people is really the thing that gives me joy. So I'm just really grateful and thankful that you chose to be in conversation with me.
Always. And I'm looking forward, yeah. And I'm looking forward to us, like, kind of keep holding those gates open, right? Because I feel like that as an exercise, as I even chat with, people who are 10, 15 years younger than me, right? There are these gaps in just thought and generation that are really riveting to be engaged with right now. And so I'm fully committed to that. I think it's been amazing to have you as a co-conspirator in that way. Yeah,
and we'll get to have drinks in the village sometime again, I hope.
Fingers crossed we'll get there. But I'm so glad we were able to be here. And thank you all for being here with myself and McKenzie Wark. Buy this incredible book, Sensoria. And as well, pick up a copy.
And get this one.
Yeah, exactly. You've got your reading list. And have a great rest of your day.
Thanks to Verso. Thanks to everybody behind the scenes.